truly thankful for the presence of being able to be together and to see each and every one this evening. Good to have the visitors. Good to have Brother Bishop with us. He has come a ways, and we're thankful for being able to have the opportunity to see him and for the many others that are here. Thankful for that Mary and Dave and Tim had a safe journey, and I'm sure they have some stories to tell us, but we're thankful for their safety. Remember, in our study this morning, we talked about some lessons that we can learn from Genesis chapter 2 in regards to marriage. Tonight, I'd like to look at marriage and yet look at some problems with marriage, or problems that marriage has. Truly, marriage does have problems. There might be some who enter into the marriage and they just can't imagine that there'll ever be a conflict or an issue. But what we have to keep in mind is that marriage involves three people. It involves man, it involves a woman, and it involves God. In Romans chapter 7 and verse 2, for the woman that has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he liveth. But if his husband be dead, she is loosed from the law of her husband. Have I got it up? Okay. So then, if while her husband liveth, she be married to another man, she be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she is free from that law, so that she is no adulteress, though she be married to another man. So see, just as sure as it involves two people, there will be problems. But if the marriage involves God, there will be answers. The reality is all marriages have problems. They are not all of the same nature, nor are they all of the same level of seriousness. You know, it's kind of like saying all cars have problems, and that's a true statement. But again, it depends upon the nature of the problem. It depends upon the seriousness of the problem. We say sometimes, you know, that all houses have problems, and that's true, or all churches have problems. But we understand that the making of that statement is understood from the standpoint with the qualification that the fact is that there are problems that are of a different nature, there are problems that are of different serious nature in the seriousness of them. But you know, as long as you have two people, there will be problems. Take, for example, the husband and wife in a family, in a marriage, they come from different families. And so by the very nature of that, there is the potential for parental interference in that marriage. Parents may want to influence the marriage. They may want to influence the decisions that are made in that marriage. And yet, we must not let parents run or even ruin a marriage. And truly, that is a possibility, a very distinct possibility in a marriage. And we know that there are also two different minds that are involved in a marriage. And with that, there is the possibility of communication problems. That potential exists. You know, marriages fail from a lack of communication between the husband and the wife. Sometimes there is no real bond that exists between the husband and wife, and a lot of times that is due to a lack of communication. It also, in our day and time, when culture and society is as it is, it just simply means that they live separate lives. They really just don't see all that much of one another. Therefore, there is not that time that can be spent with one another. And in all of this, when we communicate, it prevents problems of misunderstanding. And a lot of problems in a marriage is due to misunderstandings. But it is that if we are able to communicate, we are eliminating a very highly potential problem of misunderstandings. We discussed, we're going to resolve the differences. And get back to my point here. We're going to resolve the differences. We're going to discuss them. We're going to agree before we take action. We're going to grow as we communicate closer together. That is one of the benefits of communicating as husbands and wives. Also, there could be different religions involved in a marriage. And the problems for that is certainly potential for religious conflict. For instance, the problems concerning the concern that is to be had for the souls of the individuals in a marriage. How are you going to raise the kids? As a result, there's no common standard. Different things to different people because of the religious background. And it could be that it may even weaken you spiritually. So how do we avoid this conflict? Well, marry a person that fears God. Marry a person who is a faithful Christian. Marry a person that is truly faithful. Not just a Christian. Marry a person that is a truly faithful Christian. And that will certainly help to eliminate the potential problem that this might bring. Then, of course, there are two sexes involved. And there are the potential for sexual conflict. And this takes various forms: unfaithfulness, adultery, unwilling to render the due benevolence that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Sometimes because of the differences in the sexes between the marriage, there's inconsideration, lack of consideration, unloving, that can also be manifested in a marriage. But how do we avoid and resolve this is we understand what God's design, like we talked about in our study this morning in Genesis 2, to see what is God's design for marriage, since he instituted it. Since marriage is of divine origin, then we need to understand what God's design for marriage is. That helps us to consider the feelings that our mate, our spouses have, and again, communicate about those feelings. That too is a part of communication in the way that we feel about people, places, and things. And of course, in a marriage, there is different roles. And that brings on the potential conflict in leadership and a conflict in submission. We know that those different roles are clearly pointed out in the scriptures. The husbands are to lead, the wife is to submit. And we know that the problems that can happen when that is not taken care of is that husbands end up not leading. And this can be for a number of reasons. That could be that they come from a household where the mother was the prominent figure in the family. And so they simply, as a husband, do not lead. Or it could be that a wife doesn't submit. Or it could be the opposite extreme. It could be that she is domineering. And again, this can all be affected by the family relationship that they were in before they were married. And there's different views about money. Just as sure as there's two people, there are going to be different views about money, and this is going to be a potential for money problems that I understand is a major problem for divorce, is a major cause for divorce over money matters, either a lack of it or other things pertaining to it. It may be that one might spend more money. One spouse might spend more money than the other. Or may they just spend more money than is made. And so at the end of the month, as they say, there's too much month at the end of the month. And so that causes marital problems. One may be just simply selfish. They make plenty of money, they have enough for both, but one may be selfish and only will allow money to be spent on certain things in their own certain way. One spends maybe and the other person saves, and that can be a problem in a marriage. And of course, in all of this, whether we spend more money that's made or whether it is that we are not making the money that we would like to make, all of this results in debt. And debt causes arguments, and it's my understanding that that is one of the principal causes for divorce in this country. But the Bible has numerous warnings concerning the use of money. We've looked at a lot of them in the study on Sunday morning in the book of James. Out of those many warnings that are there, debt makes us a slave. And we are told to pay our debts, to owe no man anyone in the book of Romans. But that doesn't mean that we're not to be able to buy something on credit. It just simply means don't owe something and not be willing to pay. Or the fact is that we need to learn as Christians to live within our means. And that's a problem because we live in a country that really doesn't put that kind of a premium on that type of a lifestyle. The lifestyle that we're advocated to use and to exist in this country is spend more than you got, spend whatever you want, take and buy whatever you want. Don't worry, buy now, pay later. So all of this is problems that we understand and can see that truly marriage has problems. But there are reasons for the problems. And I want us to look at those reasons. I want us to look at why Christians have affairs in marriages. I want to look at how that we can solve these problems because we are talking about marriage. We're talking about something that is, as we talked about this morning, a everlasting as far as the lifespan. It is a relationship that is to last until death. And so let's look at some of these reasons as how to solve the marriage and the problems that can occur in them. So let's look at reasons, first of all. What are the reasons for the problems? One of them can be a lack of communication to God. We talked about communication a moment ago between husband and wife, but let's not forget how important that communication with God is concerned, to be committed to Him. And we know that Christians are to commit, to be disciples, and when they do, they're committing themselves to be followers. That's what a disciple is, a follower of Christ. In Luke chapter 6 and verse 46, Jesus said, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say?" In John chapter 8 and verse 31, Jesus said to those Jews that believed on him, "If you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed." So both of these verses emphasizes that if we're going to be a disciple, the true meaning of the word is that we're going to follow, we're going to do, we're going to abide in his word. And marriage involves a commitment to God's law. In Proverbs chapter 2 and verse 17, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forsakes the covenant of their God. We're going to look at this verse a little more in detail later. But looking also at what we see in Romans 7, for the woman that has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband is dead, she's loose from the law of her husband. And so if she marries while her husband lives, she is married to another man, she will be called an adulteress. But if her husband be dead, she's free from the law, so that she's no adulteress, though she be married to another man. So we see that marriage involves a lifelong commitment till death do us part. It's not just a part of a ceremony that is made up by man, but it is a part of the commitment that we make to God when we marry. And our goal in all areas of life, all of those goals must be to please God. In 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 9, therefore we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to him. That ought to be the sole goal of each and every husband, of each and every wife in a marriage relationship, to do those things that will be well-pleasing to him. If we'll do that, then our relationship with our husbands and wives will truly take care of themselves. And this lack of communication is when we're not content with merely pleasing ourselves. Somebody says, well, I'm happy with my marriage. Well, that may be well and good to a certain extent. Or merely meeting the approval of our mate. You know, someone may say that, well, we agree that this is okay. We don't have any problems with the way that we live. Well, again, that may be well and good, but just being merely happy with saying that, you know, I'm fine and my mate doesn't complain, well, the fact of the matter is, we need to ask God, is God pleased with our marriage? It matters not how well we are pleased. It doesn't matter how happy we are, because all of those conditions can exist outside of the commitment if we don't have toward God. So that's the question that needs to be asked. Is God pleased with our marriage? Is God pleased with the way our marriage is? Is God pleased with the kind of husband I am, the kind of wife that I am? Is God pleased with the attitude that I have toward this marriage? Is God pleased with the things that I refuse to do? Is God pleased with the things that I neglect to do? Is God pleased with our home? Is God pleased with our family? That's the question that we need to be asking. So not only can a lack of commitment to God be one of the reasons for problems in a marriage, but also lacking self-denial, or a way of saying it, self-control. God expects us to master self. A few months ago, we were studying on Wednesday night this subject of self-control. And in fact, our entire study is centered around the verse here in Mark chapter 8 and verse 34. When he had called the people to himself, with his disciples also, he said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. We also see another verse in 2 Peter 1 and verse 6, that in talking about the Christian graces that we need to add to our faith, he says in verse 6, to add to knowledge, self-control, to self-control, perseverance, to perseverance, godliness. So self-control. What is self-control? What is self-denial or self-control? Well, self-denial is saying no to self. And one of the things that we kept stressing in that study on Wednesday night is, of all the people that it's hardest to say no to, it's yourself. It's easy to say no to someone else, but the hardest person to say no to is me, is ourselves. But yet that's what self-denial is. Thayer says it's to forget one's self, to lose sight of oneself and one's own interest. So that's a pretty big command, isn't it? Self-denial, self-control. Thayer says it's self-government. It's governing ourselves. It's the ability to take a grip of oneself, to get a grip of oneself, as William Barclay defines it. And so we need to ask, how does this affect the marriage? How does self-control, how does self-denial, how does it fit in to marriage? Well, there are things that are involved in self-denial, self-control. As we've said, that is control of self. What do we mean by that? What's meant by that? Well, it means to control our temper. It means to control the words that come out of our mouths. It means to control the actions that we engage in. We need to be in control of those. It means that we need to be in control of our desires, our wants. We're to say no to self. So what that means is I'm to consider my mate's interest before myself. That's self-denial, self-control. And for the lack of a better word, I guess we could use other words, but the word I think is best to describe it is that we need to muzzle our own will and yield to God's will. Call it suppress or whatever other word you want to put in there. But we need to muzzle our own desire, our own will to what God's will is. You remember when Paul was speaking to Felix in Acts chapter 24 and verse 25? It says, now as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. And then in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 24, therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. So there has to be this suppression, this muzzling of our own will, and always yielding first and foremost to God's will. So in looking at all of this, see, these are the things that are going to have a huge impact on marriage. So that's why it's important that we understand, that we realize what it is and put it into practice. Do it as Jesus said. If we're going to follow him, let us deny ourselves and come and follow him. If you have financial difficulties, if you're not submissive, or if you're domineering, if you have sexual disagreements in a marriage, if you have a lack of communication, if you're lazy, if you have no help with your children, no time for each other, no initiative or drive in the marriage, tempers flare, you're not a keeper at a home, you stand back to see who gives in first, or you have just simply no patience with your mate. Maybe you have a know-it-all attitude. Maybe you have no appreciation for what the other spouse does. Then one or both parties are not denying self. So see all of the things that can come into a marriage and come into play in a marriage, all because of a lack of self-control, a lack of denying self. Another reason for problems is a failure to meet our mate's needs. You see, love demands that we seek to meet the needs of our spouses. In Ephesians 5, verse 25, we know that all through those verses, we're told how it is that as a husband, we're to love our wives as Christ loved the church. That we as husbands are to love our wives as our own body. That just as Jesus gave up his life for the church, we need to be willing to give ourselves to our wives, just as we nourish and cherish our physical body. And the wife is to see that she reverences her husband And then it's in Titus 2 and verse 4 that they admonish the young women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. So, there are really generally two reasons for conflict in a marriage. One is the couples fail to make each other happy. That's one of the reasons for conflict. And the other is the couples make each other unhappy. So sometimes needs, when they're not met, sometimes that can often be unintentional. Listen to what we read here. Couples that find their needs unmet often become thoughtless and inconsiderate. When that happens, marriages slide into ugly and destructive sins. The failure to meet these needs is often unintentional, but reaction to unmet needs develops into intentional harm. That often leads to unbearable pain and ultimately divorce. Another statement that the husband and wife who commits themselves to meet each other's needs will lay a foundation for lifelong happiness in a marriage that is deeper and more satisfying than they ever dreamed possible. So here are some reasons for the problems. Let's turn our attention and look at why do Christians have affairs. Let us understand on this point that it could happen to any of us. This is why we need to see and to be aware of the danger. You know, the dangers can be certainly understood if it is that we say, no, it'll never happen to me. But we know from 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 12, therefore let him that thinks he stands take heed, lest he fall. And that should ever be a verse that we keep in our minds. William Harley, Dr. William Harley, in a book called Surviving an Affair, says, it became clear to me early in my counseling experiences that affairs were much more common than I'd ever imagined. But now, after years of marriage counseling, I've come to realize that almost everyone, given the right conditions, would have an affair. So why would Christians have an affair? Well, the real danger comes when some act like they don't know how it happened. How did it happen? You know, somebody has an automobile accident. How did it happen? Well, you know, I don't know. I don't know how it happened. It just happened. Or the situation with a firearm, you know, I'm not sure how the gun did that. It just happened. We had a family in the church at Wise who had a son. He was almost 20 years old. He had a gun, a handgun, and he'd been told by his uncle he needed to get rid of the gun because it just simply had a too sensitive trigger. Well, one night about 12 or 1 o'clock, he was showing it to his sister's boyfriend, and the gun went off. And it shot him, the boy that owned the gun, in his head, and he was killed instantly. How did it happen? Well, it just happened. Well, you know, accidents just don't happen. There is a cause. And if we don't figure out how accidents happen, then it's going to likely be that it'll happen again. And if we know how accidents happen, then we're in a position where that we can prevent them from happening. So how does it happen? How do affairs among Christians happen? I don't know how it happened. It just happened. Well, the affair, it just didn't happen. There are and were causes. And if we can figure out how, then it's likely, if we can't figure out how, it's likely to happen again. And if we do figure out how that the affair happened, then the next one can be prevented. So affairs just don't happen. Belinda Elliott said, contrary to what some people believe, affairs never just happen. There's always a natural progression that leads to adultery. Couples need to be aware of the treacherous steps that lead to infidelity so that they can better protect their marriages. Keith Dewey made the statement, how does adultery happen? People don't just decide one day to be unfaithful to their spouses. Adultery is the culminating act of a dozen or more tiny steps of unfaithfulness. Each step in itself does not seem that serious or much beyond the previous step. Satan draws a person into adultery one tiny step at a time. And he does this over time so that our conscience is gradually seared. That makes it easier to take just one more step thinking such a tiny step won't hurt us. Why do Christians have affairs? I think there's two root reasons. And we find those in Proverbs chapter 2 and verse 17. We looked at this a moment ago. Who forsakes the companion of their youth and forgets the covenant of her God? What's one of the roots? The marriage deteriorates. He forsakes the companion of her youth. What's the other root cause of affairs? Their faith gets weaker. And that's stated in they forget the covenant of her God. But those things don't happen to those that are in a great marriage. Those things don't happen to those who have a strong faith. What causes faith to get weaker? Well, little time for spiritual things. Who of us here doesn't know Matthew 6 and verse 33 by heart? Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all of these things shall be added to you. Faith gets weaker when we don't study as we should. Acts chapter 17, verse 11, these were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness and searched the scriptures daily to find out whether those things were so. How does our faith get weaker? We don't pray as much. We're told in Daniel chapter 6 and verse 10 that now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home and in his upper room with his windows open toward Jerusalem. He knelt down on his knees 3 times that day and prayed and gave thanks before God, as was his custom since early days. A king had passed a law not to pray. But no, that didn't stop Daniel. He believed in what Paul said in 1 Thessalonians, pray without ceasing. What happens that causes a person to get weaker? Well, whatever it is that happens, it happens gradually. In Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1, therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things that we have heard, lest we drift away. So when our faith gets weaker, material and worldly things have a greater attraction to us. When our faith gets weaker, we fear the Lord less. When our faith gets weaker, we're not bothered by sin. No, not like we used to be, not like we was. And when our faith gets weaker, it's easier to do the things that we know to be wrong. And so, we see the root cause of affairs. But we look at another one. We said that the marriage deteriorates. And that is because there's little time spent with each other. Like what we see in Ephesians 5, verses 25 through 28. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. So there's little time, when there is little time for each other, that can be a contributing factor to why affairs occur. We let up on communicating. You know, in 1 Peter chapter 3, we're told in verse 1, wives likewise be submissive to your own husbands, that even if one does not obey the word, they without a word may be won by the conduct of their wives, when they observe your chaste conduct accompanied by fear. Do not let your adornment be merely outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God. For in this manner, in former times, the holy women who trusted in God also adorned themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters you are, if you do good, and are not afraid with any terror. Now listen to verse 7. Husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding. Give honor to the wife as to the weaker vessel, and being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. How can there be understanding without communication? There can't be. It's impossible. So we as husbands have a responsibility of understanding our wives. And that's only going to come as a result of the more that we communicate with one another and the more time that we spend with one another. And so the emotional needs are not met, and that causes the marriage to deteriorate. Paul talked about that in 1 Corinthians 5 when he talked about how they're not to defraud one another. And the reason for it is that Satan will tempt you for your lack of self-control. We're going to look at that verse in just a minute. And again, the deterioration of a marriage, it happens gradually. We looked at that verse, let's look at it again. Therefore, we must give the more earnest heed to the things that we have heard, lest we drift away. We need to give the more earnest heed to our marriages, lest they drift away, unless our marriages deteriorate. So let's remind ourselves again of the two root causes and see that what we're talking about here, when our marriage deteriorates, we're going to be committed to our mate less. When our marriages deteriorate, we're going to focus on ourselves, not on our spouse. When our marriage deteriorates, we're at great risk. When the opposite sex shows interest or gives us attention. And when our marriages deteriorate, one way we can tell is that we're not bothered by flirting. Whether we're giving it or whether we're receiving it, we're not bothered about it. So again, let's look at these two root causes. Who forsakes the companion of her youth? Marriage is deteriorated. Forgets the covenant of her God. Faith is getting weaker. So these two things can be summed up, I believe, in one word, and that's the word careless. One being careless is not likely to see the snares of how words can be taken. One that is careless cannot see the snare of how that their actions can be considered, how their actions can be perceived. And one that is careless is not likely to see the snare of how the situation may look. They just don't see it because they're careless. David was careless. You remember in 2 Samuel 11, verse 1, it happened in the spring of the year at the time when kings go out to battle. David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. and they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Ramoth, but David remained at Jerusalem. Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. So David sent and inquired about the woman. And someone said, Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Elam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Then David sent messengers and took her. And she came to him, and he lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to her house. And the woman conceived. So she sent and told David and said, I am with child. David was careless. His eyes gazed at Bathsheba. He inquired and he sent for her. We're warned all through the scriptures about carelessness. We're told that we don't need to play with fire. We need to run. In Proverbs chapter 5 and verse 8, remove your way far from her and do not go near the door of her house. It's what Joseph did. Remember in Genesis 39 and verse 12 that she caught him by his garment saying, lie with me, but he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. You know, all too often, men and women become too familiar with each other. They're not careful about what they talk about to each other. They're not careful about how long they talk with each other. They don't take in consideration how they touch each other. They don't take in consideration what it means to be alone together. And they certainly don't take consideration of the time that they spend together. But carelessness in not understanding the tools that the devil uses, like flirting with the eyes, like Proverbs states in Proverbs 6 and verse 25, do not lust after her beauty in your heart, nor let her allure you with her eyelids. Then there is the tool of flattery and lies that are so easy to be said. In Proverbs 6 and verse 24, keep you from the evil woman, from the flattering tongue of a seductress. In chapter 7, verse 15, so I came out to meet you, diligently to seek your face, and I found you. And verse 21 says, with her enticing speech, she caused him to yield. With her flattering lips, she seduced him. And then there's that tool of the look and the lusting, like what we saw in the case of David. But in Proverbs 6 and verse 25, again, the verse that we read, do not lust after her beauty in your heart, nor let her allure you with her eyelids. And you remember that statement Jesus made in Matthew 5 and verse 28? But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And then there's always that attraction of the attire, what's worn. In Proverbs 7 and verse 10, for there is a woman met him with the attire of a harlot and a crafty heart. So that's why Christians have affairs. Now I want us to look at how do we solve the problems. Divorce is not the answer. We must not divorce except for fornication, being the cause. In Matthew chapter 19, verse 3, the Pharisee came to him, testing him and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he that made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh? So then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. Then they said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce to put her away? And he said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. So see, we cannot divorce except for the cause of fornication. And when problems arise, all talk about divorce is to be off the table. It's not even to be in the matter of the subject whatsoever. And neither is separation the answer. You know, it's common for people to think, well, you know, I know we can't divorce, but we can separate. Well, what people do when conflict arises, one just leaves. They walk off. But the Bible only gives one cause for separation. One cause for divorce. We've done looked at that one. Matthew 19:9. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for fornication and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. Only one cause for divorce, the committing of adultery. There's only one cause for separation, and that's in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 5. Do not be deprived one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So, any other cause, whether it's for divorce or whether it's for separation, any other cause is contrary to the Scriptures. So divorce is not the answer to the problem of marriage. Neither is separation the answer to the problem of marriage. So how do we prevent and how do we resolve the problems? Well, we need to work daily at building our faith. We need to study. Romans 10:17, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. We need to be that people of the book that we used to be, and how the people used to refer to those that were members of the Lord Church. But we've gotten away from that. We can go for days and not open a Bible. But we need to study, we need to pray. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 17, pray without ceasing. Somebody says, well, that's just too simple. No, it isn't. That's the answer. Call it simple if you want. That's the answer to the problems. It's just to making the application of the answers. To take the time, to make the time to study. To take the time, to make the time to pray. So we work daily at trying to build our faith. And we need not to neglect each other. We need to take time for your marriage. Remember that word that we talked about in our study this morning, the word cleave? In the New King James, it says joined. So whether it's joined or whether it's cleaved, the idea is to glue, to be cemented together to our mates. And that's what Jesus advocated there in Matthew 19 and verse 4. He answered and said, have you not read that he that made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So we need to remember that we're glued to that mate, that spouse. And we need to take time for each other. In Ephesians 5, verse 16, we need to redeem the time because the days are evil. Well, just for the reasons we said that we can have an affair as a Christian, we need to be redeeming the time. And a lot of that time needs to be redeemed with our spouses, not separated and apart from them. We need to share our lives. We need to communicate with each other. Again, 1 Peter 3 and verse 7, husbands likewise dwell with them with understanding. How can there be understanding if there's no communicating? One other quote. When you stop to think about it, privacy isn't something that improves marriage. It's honesty and openness that improve marriages. The more information you have about each other's thoughts and activities, the easier it is to meet each other's needs and resolve conflicts. Privacy actually blocks access to that important information, and that ultimately leads to marital failure. How do we prevent? How do we resolve? We need to make our goal to emphasize the spiritual. Our purpose. What is our purpose? Our purpose is to serve God. Ecclesiastes 12, many of us, I'm sure, can quote that. Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. We need to put spiritual matters first. Matthew 6:33, seek first. And again, what comes before first? Nothing. But the wrong goals will destroy. Remember the rich young ruler in Matthew 19? He seemed to have an interest in spiritual things. He seemed to have an interest in wanting to go to heaven. He had obeyed the commandments from a youth. But you remember the one thing that Jesus said you lack? Go and sell what you have, give it to the poor, and you'll have treasure in heaven. And what happened? The young man went away sorrowful because he had great possessions. What does that say? That says that his interest really wasn't in spiritual things. It says that his interest really wasn't in going to heaven. His interest was here on things of this earth, the things that he could possess, the things that he could hold in his hands. The wrong goals destroyed him, and it'll destroy the marriage. We need to make our goals to emphasize the spiritual because we need to be careful with our behavior around the opposite sex. Remember, there's somebody that trusts you. And that statement of Genesis 39, going back to Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Remember verse 8? He refused and said to his master's wife, look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he's committed all that he has to my hand. See, Joseph understood that someone was watching. Joseph knew that he had a responsibility to Potiphar. But also Joseph knew he had a greater responsibility to someone else, and that was to God. But the truth of the matter is, we all need to remember that there are those who trust us. And if we're in a marriage relationship, there's no other person that trusts us even more than that of our spouse. God trusts us, yes, but so does our spouse. And we need to never spend time alone. I don't know of how many gospel preachers that I've heard of down through the years that have committed fornication because of the time that they have spent with women of the opposite sex. Oh, it was all good intentions. It was all for a good cause. But remember, we read that a moment ago, it just takes the gradual steps. Genesis 39, verse 11, but it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was inside. See, that's when she took advantage of the opportunity, when they were alone. Don't never let an opportunity to be taken to you, to me, because we are alone with the opposite sex. So here's what we've had. We've talked about how that marriages have problems. We've looked at the reasons. We've looked at why Christians have affairs, and we've looked at how to solve the problems. So truly, let there not be anyone here, whether you are contemplating marriage or whether marriage is way out there, you don't know when. Don't never contemplate the fact that there'll be a marriage that you can enter into, that there'll never be a conflict, there'll never be a strain. Because marriages have problems. But let us be familiar with the reasons. Let us be understanding how that affairs can happen. Let us understand that there is the solution to these problems. And again, like we said this morning, some people talk about, well, life doesn't have a manual. Some people say marriage doesn't have a manual. Yes, it does. This is it. This is the marriage manual. Everything we need to know about it, how to live, how to be responsible, our responsibilities in it can all be found in the pages of God's Word. The very one that instituted marriage is the one that we need to turn to and see what he says concerning this very important matter. And let's remind ourselves again of what we read a moment ago in 1 Peter. Husbands and wives are heirs together of the grace of life. Your marriage can determine your eternal destiny. That's how serious of a relationship it is. That's why we say that there are two important times in a person's life. Number one, when they decide to become a Christian. And the other is who you're going to marry. There are two no greater decisions to be made than those two. Because eternity depends upon both of them. So tonight, if we can assist you in obedience to the gospel, or if you're here and as a Christian need to have those things in your life repented of, confessed, we stand ready and willing to put our lives, to help all of us to have our lives right before God, that we may have that hope of heaven. While together we stand and sing, come forward if you